I mean, I was with Mercedes for a long, long time, so I know how it works there. And in qualifying, they have another mode that they're able to go to, a bit like party mode back in the day. And once they get to Q2, they switch that on, and we don't have that. So whatever that is, and then.
Well done. It's a good race.
Yeah, pace was strong. It's a shame there was a bit more fighting than what I would have hoped.
The Chinese Grand Prix arrived very early in the season, but already with enormous pressure on Ferrari. After what happened in the previous race, the Italian team needed to show that their project really had the potential to fight at the front. However, the sprint format of the weekend made the situation even more complicated. Only one practice session before going directly into qualifying. That meant that any small mistake in the car's setup could ruin the entire weekend. In that context, attention was completely focused on one of the biggest stories of the season. The new Ferrari duo formed by Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. Two drivers with championship ambitions, two completely different styles, and gigantic media pressure watching every movement inside the red garage. For Leclerc, this weekend had a special meaning. 4 years he had been the pillar of the Ferrari project, the driver around whom the team had built its future. But Hamilton's arrival completely changed the internal balance. Suddenly, every session became a direct comparison between two of the most talented drivers on the grid. The China sprint began with a clear feeling within Ferrari. The weekend was still open. Despite the frustration in sprint qualifying, Charles Leclerc still had a chance to make up ground on the track. In a short race like this, where every lap counts and the margins between cars are usually minimal, a good start or a small mistake by a rival can completely change the result. But there was also another factor that was beginning to play an important role: internal pressure. Because while Leclerc was trying to rebuild his weekend after the technical problem in qualifying, Lewis Hamilton arrived at the sprint with a completely different feeling. The Briton had managed to put in a solid lap in the previous session and seemed increasingly comfortable with the Ferrari. For someone who was only competing in his second Grand Prix with the Italian team, the adaptation was being faster than many expected. When the lights went out in Shanghai, both Ferraris knew that the objective was clear. Score points, stay close to their direct rivals, and confirm that the car had the potential that the team believed it had. However, as the laps progressed, the car's behavior began to show some of the weaknesses that had already appeared on Friday. The Shanghai circuit is especially demanding with energy management and traction. Long support curves and accelerations in slow zones force drivers to precisely manage the balance between power and control of the car. And it was precisely in that area where new frustrations began to appear for Leclerc. During the sprint race, the Monegasque again communicated by radio with the team, showing his concern about the behavior of the car, especially at the exit of the corners. He reported traction and wheel spin problems in the final sector, a situation that made it extremely difficult to apply full power without losing stability. In a modern Formula One car, that type of behavior can be related to torque management, electronics, or even the way hybrid power is delivered. That problem was not minor. In a sprint where all the drivers are riding at the limit, any difficulty in traction can cost tenths of a second on each lap. And when those tenths accumulate, they end up becoming seconds compared to direct rivals. The tension reached its most delicate point at a specific moment in the race. During a restart after a neutralized phase, Leclerc came very close to losing control of the Ferrari by accelerating too aggressively. The car began to slide on the exit of the corner, forcing him to correct quickly to avoid a spin that would have completely ruined his sprint. Although he managed to keep the car on the track, that moment perfectly reflected the situation he was experiencing. A driver pushing a car to the limit that did not quite behave as expected. Meanwhile, on the other side of the garage, Hamilton was experiencing a completely different career. The Brit remained much calmer in his communications with the team. His radio messages were mainly focused on analyzing the car and identifying where Ferrari needed to improve. He again noted that the SF26 had good cornering performance, but insisted that the team was losing too much time on the straights due to power and energy management. That contrast began to attract attention within the paddock. Because while Leclerc seemed to constantly struggle with the car's behavior, Hamilton conveyed an image of control and experience, managing the race with a much more strategic perspective. And at Ferrari, where every detail is analyzed at the highest level, this difference in sensations between the two drivers began to generate an uncomfortable question. Were these simply circumstances of the weekend? Or was a much more complex internal dynamic beginning to emerge within the team? The Chinese sprint had not yet caused a direct confrontation between Hamilton and Leclerc. But he had made something clear. Tension was growing, and if Ferrari could not solve the car's problems quickly, that internal pressure could become one of the big issues of the season. As the China sprint came to an end, Ferrari left the circuit with more questions than answers. On paper, the result might have seemed like just part of a difficult weekend in a season that was just beginning. But within the team and also in the entire Formula One paddock, the feeling was different. Because what the sprint race really left behind was not just a result. It was a very clear image of two completely different dynamics within the same garage. On one side was Charles Leclerc, a driver who for years has been the face of the Ferrari project. The Monegasque has shouldered the responsibility of returning the Italian team to the fight for championships and has been, until now, the internal reference. But in Shanghai he found himself in an uncomfortable situation, frustrated by the technical problems, pushing the car to the limit and showing his displeasure on the radio when the Ferrari did not respond as expected at key moments. The problem with the hybrid deployment in the sprint classification had been the first blow. But what happened during the sprint ended up amplifying that feeling of frustration. Every difficulty with traction, every moment in which the car seemed to escape his grasp, fueled the feeling that his weekend was being much more complicated than he expected. And at the same time, on the other side of the garage, the story seemed to move in a completely different direction. Lewis Hamilton was experiencing a process that many within Formula One did not expect to see so soon. Only in his second Grand Prix with Ferrari, the Briton was beginning to show clear signs of adapting to the car. It wasn't just about pure speed, but something even more important: his way of understanding the car. Throughout the weekend, Hamilton focused on analyzing the behavior of the Ferrari, highlighting that the car performed well in corners but pinpointing where the weaknesses were, especially in straight-line speed and power system management. That analytical, almost surgical approach was reminiscent of the way the Briton had worked for years at Mercedes, and at Ferrari they were beginning to see the value of that experience. But at the same time, this difference in sensations between the two pilots began to create an inevitable narrative. Because when two drivers of that level share a team, each weekend becomes a direct comparison. Each session, each radio, and each result begins to form part of a story that goes far beyond a simple race. In Shanghai, that story was beginning to take shape. It was not yet an open rivalry. There was no direct confrontation on the track or controversial statements between both drivers. But there was something more subtle, and perhaps more dangerous. A growing contrast between the pilot who seemed to find answers and the pilot who was still struggling with the questions. Ferrari, as a team, knows perfectly well how delicate a situation like this can be. The history of Formula One is full of examples where two extremely competitive drivers within the same team ended up generating internal tensions that were difficult to control. And when that happens at Ferrari, the media pressure multiplies like nowhere else in the paddock. For now, everything was still under control. But China's sprint left a very clear feeling. This was not going to be a quiet year inside the red garage, because Ferrari now has two drivers capable of fighting for victories, two completely different mentalities, and a car that still needs to evolve to be at the level of the best. And when these three variables intersect in Formula One, an internal battle almost always ends up appearing that can mark the entire season. Shanghai may have only been the first sign. The China sprint was not just another short race on the season calendar. In fact, it was the first moment in which it began to be clearly perceived how Ferrari's internal dynamics could develop during this year. Because beyond the results, what the weekend really left was a very clear image of two different paths within the same team. On the one hand, a Lewis Hamilton appeared who, in just his second Grand Prix dressed in red, began to demonstrate something that many doubted: his ability to quickly adapt to the Ferrari and understand its strengths and weaknesses. Throughout the weekend he was analytical, focused on the overall performance of the car and pinpointing where Ferrari still needs to improve, especially in energy management and straight-line speed. And on the other side of the garage we saw Charles Leclerc having a much more frustrating weekend. The problem with the hybrid deployment during sprint qualifying ruined his key lap right at the decisive moment, something that caused his immediate reaction on the radio asking what was happening with the car. That moment reflected the tension of a pilot who knew that the mistake had not been his, but that still left him in a complicated position against his new teammate. That contrast is what really begins to build the story within Ferrari. Because when two drivers of the level of Hamilton and Leclerc share a team, every small detail is magnified. Each session becomes a direct comparison. Each radio reveals emotions, and each result begins to feed a narrative that can set the course of the entire season. Ferrari now has something that many teams would like: two drivers capable of winning races and fighting for championships. But at the same time, that also means that the internal balance of the team will be more important than ever. If Ferrari manages to manage that rivalry intelligently, it could become one of its greatest strengths in the fight for the championship. But if tension begins to grow as the season progresses, then the Italian team could face a challenge that has already marked many chapters in its history: maintaining harmony between two leaders within the same garage. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.